Hi everyone and welcome to the channel, and I'm here for a list video for you guys. Now for this list video, I'll be going over some of my favorite vinyl albums of all time. Now these are albums that ended up being the band's final album, their last album before they call it quits, of course. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started with this video. I think the first album we'll talk about is Soundgarden, King Animal. Now, there are some people that say that this is one of Soundgarden's weakest, if not their weakest. For me, I would definitely agree that it's one of their weakest albums. Now, as far as everything that I have heard, this is by far my least favorite thing from Soundgarden, but even in saying that, it's not bad. I mean, Soundgarden doesn't really make bad albums. But, yeah, this album, it just doesn't do as much for me as their classic albums do. This album just is not as musically captivating as their earlier albums, of course. Especially Bad Motorfinger and Super Unknown, which I think are their best work. But with this album, it's still not bad. Of course, this came out in 2012, and there are some really good songs on this album, and some songs that I do think are underrated, like the song Worst Dreams. That's a song that I actually really enjoy a lot, and I think the melodies in that song are very memorable. So yeah, I mean, there is some good stuff on the album, but to me it's not one of Soundgarden's best, but it still is a really good album for what it is. So King Animal by Soundgarden. Next we got Rush with Clockwork Angels. Not one of my personal favorite Rush albums, and I think there's a lot of people that can agree that this is not one of their best. I think their best work comes from the 70s and early 80s time. Now, there are some people that do say that this is Rush's best album of their modern era. Would I agree with that? Maybe. I mean, it might be the best of their modern era. Sometimes that does change, sometimes. But yeah, because Rush has never released a bad album as well. There are no bad Rush albums. But with Clockwork Angels, do I think it's a good finale for the band? Sure. And of course, rest in peace to Neil Peart, who we lost last year, of course. And he was an excellent drummer, probably one of the greatest drummers of all time. And, you know, the whole band really does shine on this album. Now, you could tell at this point, Geddy Lee, like, he doesn't have that same vocal range as he did in the 70s or even the 80s and in the 90s. I mean, you can tell that Rush was kind of reaching the end of their discography at this point. But it's still a very good album. I mean, of course, you got the title track, really great song. You also got the Wreckers and the Garden, which are also good. But yeah, pretty heavy album too, I must say. Rush's more modern era is pretty heavy for the most part. Not as proggy as their earlier work. Now, some of that prog stuff still is in this album, but it's just not as present as it once was in previous albums. So, yeah, kind of straightforward. You know, their more modern work is a little more straightforward, of course, but that's not a bad thing, of course, because it's still a very good album. So, Clockwork Angels by Rush. Next, we got Genesis, Calling All Stations. Of course, the only album with Ray Wilson on vocals. And, you know, when some people rank the Genesis discography, there's some people that have this way last, of course. I feel like most people say that this is their weakest album. For me, I would agree that it is one of their weakest albums, but I don't think that the album is as bad as some people make it out to be. There's some very good songs on the album, especially the first 3 tracks, the title track, Congo, and Shipwrecked. All really good songs. I mean, some of these songs are very catchy, of course, especially Congo. It's very radio-friendly and just fun to listen to. It's memorable, and Ray doesn't sound too bad on this album. Yeah, it doesn't sound like Genesis. I mean, you might argue that he's not really a good fit for Genesis, but for what the album is, it's not bad. I think it's a decent finale. Now, I would have preferred if Genesis kind of maybe made an album or two after this, and you know, sometimes it does make you wonder, like, what would have happened if Genesis were to continue after this? Like, would they still have Ray Wilson as their vocalist? Like, what would those albums be like with Ray Wilson? it kind of raises a lot of questions, I think. Like, I kind of think, like, maybe, like, they'll do what Black Sabbath has done, maybe release some more albums until they get their original singer back or something. Like, maybe their final album, they have either Peter Gabriel or Phil Collins as their vocalist or something like that. I don't know, man. It makes you wonder, but yeah. So you could argue that this is not really a good finale for the band, but I think it's a good album, even though it's not one of their best. So, Calling All Stations by Genesis. So next, we got King Crimson, The Power to Believe. Pretty heavy album too, probably one of King Crimson's heaviest albums. Again, like with the last Rush album, not as proggy as their earlier work, but some of that prog still is in this album for sure, and yeah, very solid album for sure. I mean, of course, you got Level 5, Eyes Wide Open, and many others. But yeah, not really much to say about it. Do I think it's a good finale for King Crimson? I think so, for the most part. I mean, you could argue that they could have done more, but I don't know. I know that they've been mainly focusing on doing live stuff now, which is fine, of course, but yeah, not a bad finale for King Crimson. So, The Power to Believe by King Crimson. Next, we got Van Halen, A Different Kind of Truth. One of Van Halen's weakest albums, in my opinion. This album did come out in 2012 as well. Yeah, 2012 seemed to be the year where all these legendary rock bands released their final album. I'm not sure why that is, why these bands decided to do that in 2012. I'm not sure, but it's just something that I've noticed. But good album, but again, just not one of their best. You could tell that David Lee Roth is not as into it as he was in the late 70s, early 80s with this band. The album does lack replay value, but it still does have some decent tracks, of course, like Stay Frosty and Beats Workin', of course. The second half of this album is surprisingly very good, I think. Of course, you got some good songs in the first half, like She's the Woman. Now, there is the song Tattoo, which is the album opener. For me, I've never really been the biggest fan of this song. I know some people are not a big fan of it. I mean, it's not bad, but I've just never been a big fan of that song. It's not one of my favorites, to be honest. But A Different Kind of Truth by Van Halen, it's a decent album, and, you know, it's good. It's a good finale for Van Halen because, you know, this is the album where they had David Lee Roth back. I mean, the best Van Halen singer is on this album, on their final album. However, you can tell, once again, he's not as into it with this album as he would have been, say, on their debut album, or Van Halen 2, or Fair Warning, for example. But not a bad album. So next, we got Led Zeppelin, In Through the Outdoor. Now, some people might be saying, wait a minute, I thought Coda was their final album. But Coda is not really a studio album from Led Zeppelin. It's just a compilation of rarities and stuff like that. So In Through the Outdoor is technically Led Zeppelin's final main studio album. And would I say that it's a good finale for the band? Yeah, I think it's a good finale. I mean, it's not one of Led Zeppelin's best, but it's definitely not bad, though. Led Zeppelin is another band that doesn't make any bad albums. Yeah, definitely a really great band, and one of those bands that immediately come to mind when I think of essential rock bands. I mean, if you're a rock music fan and you're not a fan of Led Zeppelin yet, I mean, you really gotta check them out if you haven't checked them out already, of course. But yeah, and give them a listen for sure, because this is a band that obviously means a lot to hard rock and music in general, really. But In Through the Outdoor, yeah, it's not one of their best. It's not as good as, you know, their earlier work, but it's not bad, though. Of course, you got songs like In the Evening and All My Love. I'm Gonna Crawl is another really good one. Kind of a darker sounding album for Led Zeppelin, probably their darkest sounding album too. But it's not really one that I return to very much, but it's not a bad finale for their studio catalog, of course. So and Through the Outdoor by Led Zeppelin. So next, we got Black Sabbath, 13. Of course, their final album, and this is when Ozzy came back. Ozzy decided to come back to finish the Black Sabbath discography. And, you know, I will admit, when I first listened to this album, I wasn't really as into it as much, but I continued to give it more chances, and you know what? I think it's a solid album. It's actually pretty stellar. Maybe you can argue that this was their best album in a good number of years, maybe. I mean, Ozzy, I think, is the best Black Sabbath singer after all. You could tell that Black Sabbath was really trying to go back to their roots, and they kind of do to an extent on this album. I mean, it's dark, it's doomy, and it just sounds really good overall. I mean, I think Loner is probably the best song on the album, to me anyway. It kind of reminds me of their earlier work. So, yeah, 13 by Black Sabbath. Definitely a very strong album, and definitely not a bad way to end off their career. So, yeah, definitely great stuff. So lastly, for this video, we got Death, The Sound of Perseverance. There are some people that say that this is Death's best album, and there are some people that say that it's their weakest, or at least one of their weakest. I'm actually in that opinion that does say that this is one of their weakest, and that's kind of surprising since this is their proggiest album. And you know me, I'm a pretty big prog guy, of course, and you know, I do love my prog in my music, but to me, Death is really the best at, you know, making that traditional death metal that's, you know, in their previous material, the albums that came before this, and even Symbolic, for example. But yeah, but still a very good album. Death is another band that has never released a bad album. I mean, a lot of really great songs on here. Of course, Spirit Crusher, Story to Tell, Flesh and the Power It Holds, which is maybe one of my favorite Death songs. Of course, Voice of the Soul. You got a Judas Priest cover on here, Painkiller, not too bad. But yeah, not a bad finale for Death. I mean, of course, rest in peace to Chuck as well. I mean, he really left behind some really great material and just a fantastic band. So yeah, Death, The Sound of Perseverance. That's what's coming up last in this video. So let me know what you guys think. What are some final albums that you can think of that you really like? And do you think that they're really good finales for the band? And what do you think of this list? Do you agree with my choices for this video? Feel free to let me know. So on that note, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. So thanks for watching, and take care.